Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hendricks, and our guest today is Dr. Karen Kelly. She has a pretty unique job. She is a physiologist, and she specializes in warfighter performance. So, welcome, Doctor. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, let's start off. We get right to it. We don't dilly-dally around on the Jobs Podcast. Let's start with the early origin story of Dr. Kelly and kind of a quick upbringing about where you were born, early influences, family members in your line of work, or maybe not, and just go from there.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, I was born and raised in Pasadena, California, just actually up off of Eaton Canyon, that where we just had the recent fires. And I lived there my entire life until I moved down to San Diego for college. But my entire family was actually in business, except for my dad did have an early education in physical education, and he ran the Lockheed Employee Recreation program for Lockheed Martin when they were based out of Burbank. So
Hmm,
I guess you could say my dad was probably my early influence. He played baseball throughout his entire life, went to college on a baseball scholarship, played in the minors, and was pulled up for the Orioles for a few years. So I just grew
cool.
up living a very active lifestyle, has always been interested in sports, played sports my entire life. And so I'd say he's probably my most influential person. However, my mom also was an avid cook. She was Italian, so I also was just raised very healthy and like healthy lifestyle, healthy living, very active.
Sure.
Growing up on the canyon, we hiked every weekend, built forts and played like, kids did back in the 70s and 80s,
Right.
So yeah, to date myself.
No, you had to be home when the street light came on was about the rule in my house. So
Exactly. Same here. And they usually hose us off in the driveway because we were so dirty and, prior to coming in the house. So
yeah.
yeah.
Did you have any early interest in? I mean, I know you were active and your parents were involved in sports to varying degrees. Did you know that something related to athletics would be in your future, or when did you kind of start to narrow into physiology?
I have always been interested in sports and athletics, and I wanted to go into sports medicine. Actually, I was going to go to medical school. I took my MCAT. I was going to go down that whole route, and then
Mm,
one day I just decided to pack up all my things with my friend and put it all in my parents' garage, and we went backpacking for 6 months. And just decided to try and figure out what I really wanted to do. I think at the time I was volunteering. I was an EMT. I'm in a small hospital here in San Diego that no longer exists. I worked in the emergency room. And I think just being raised very naturopathically, not that I'm not against Western medicine by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that I think the way I was raised very healthy, holistically, I just saw that a lot of our medical care was more of pushing pharmaceuticals, which is not the way I was raised. And so I just decided to go down a different path. Like I didn't want to go down that path, but at the time I didn't know what it was. So my one of my best friends and I backpacked for 6 months throughout Southeast Asia back in the late 90s, and a lot of the times we be alone in a tent or on a boat somewhere, and we would just talk about what I like to do, what my interests were, and she said, "You always like exercise, you always like nutrition. Why don't you go into that field?" And back in 1997, exercise science, exercise physiology wasn't a large area, so I didn't really know what I could do in that field. But I decided just to take my GRE when I came back. My parents sent me a study guide book to Singapore. I picked it up in a post office, studied for 3 months on the back half of my trip, and came home and took the last paper-based GRE, and then said I'd just go to grad school for something and figure it out. And I happened to stumble upon a program at UC San Diego that was an exercise science certificate program. It wasn't a degree, but when I started that program, all my teachers had master's degrees in exercise physiology from San Diego State, and that's where it pointed me to that direction of going down that career field. So it was just kind of a random me Google searching or not even, I think the internet was still pretty young at the time, but like
web
looking
crawler or something like
web,
that.
yeah, like dot matrix style, like trying
Yeah,
to
yeah.
find
Mhm.
information. I was, or, just kind of boots on the ground of like, talking to people and, asking them what they did and how they got to where they were. And that's how I figured out, sort of this exercise physiology, path. So it
The
wasn't
exercise
conventional.
the exercise physiology program, that's not just a 4-year degree. You're going to extended training afterwards? Is it, or does almost everybody get a master's or a PhD? How does that typically work?
Yes, you can do both. So my
Okay.
most of the people that work on my team, for example, my research team, they all have master's degrees. And so one of my students that's up at USC, she's obviously earning her doctorate. But the majority of people in our field do just have masters. If you want to seek the higher level of education and become a principal investigator like myself, or have a different type of career path, then you would go on for PhDs. So there are undergraduate programs in exercise science, exercise physiology, but really the graduate level is what's needed to really land a good position, let's say with a sports team or in the military, for example.
So, what you just mentioned right there, where do most of the people that follow your career path end up as far as, is it more a private sector, a line of employment, or is it more academia, or is it kind of split down the middle?
I think it's both, not so much academia, because then to be in academia, you do need your doctorate to have a full-time tenure track position at the majority of universities. You can be adjunct professors or or teach at community college with a master's degree, but really for a four-year university, they typically require a PhD level
Mm,
degree. So, for example, in research, when I was at the Cleveland Clinic, I did my postdoc at the Cleveland Clinic, and we had a lot of master's students there that were working on various grants and projects within our department. Within the government sector, most of our research assistants, and there's varying levels of senior scientists, one, two, three, for example, through our contract agencies, they all have their master's degree in exercise science of some sort, depending on the needs of the principal investigators. So you see that with sports teams. I have a lot of friends that are working with various sports teams or rehab clinics or wellness programs or wellness clinics that have their master's degree.
well, did you have anything lined up, like you were already working in your field as you progressed through the final stages of your education, or did you go straight through and then enter the workforce with your training?
No, so I have a pretty unconventional path in the sense that I did my undergraduate degree in biology at UC San Diego when I thought I was going to go pre-med. And I finished my degree in about three and a half years. So I finished school early. So I was fairly young still. So I took a year off to study for my MCATs when I thought I
Mm,
wanted to go to medical school. And then when I didn't do that, I came back to grad school. I went through to my master's degree, which took 2 years, and then I went straight to my doctoral program up at USC, and that took me a little bit longer than normal. USC's typical programs are usually about 5 years, but mine took a little longer because I was married and I got pregnant with my son at the time.
mm,
So I had to take some time out of the lab. At the time there, I was working on I was working with some radioactive compounds, so I didn't obviously want to be in the laboratory when I was pregnant
sure.
with my son. So I took some time off and just taught, and then I went straight from there into a 3-year postdoc. So when I finally secured my job with the Navy, and my mom, if she was still alive today, would tell you she was so happy because it was finally in her mind my first real job, because I had just been in training training forever, like
Right, right.
4 years undergrad, 2 years master's, so that's 6 years of PhD program, 12 years, and 3 years of postdoc. So it was like a 15-year training evolution for me prior to, really securing a first job. I mean, as a postdoc, you're paid, obviously, but it's not commensurate with a salary that you can actually live on. So
Right.
it's a long, for me, because I had started a family in there. I had my daughter during my postdoc, so I balanced profession and a family life. Some people choose not to do that. So it really just depends on the individual and if they want to start a family while they're in the middle of their schooling, or if they want to wait to do that. But not everyone has to do that. Not everyone does postdocs. I highly recommend them. Not everyone gets a master's degree. Some people go straight from undergrad to PhD. I feel the master's is a really important step, but that's just from my time in education. I think it really gives people an interim time to really dabble in research, to decide if that's something they really would like to do, kind of learn more of that self-study that goes into a PhD program. So it just depends on the individual and really what their career goals are.
So you finished up, as you described it, or your mom described it, you got your first real job with the Navy. What did you start doing with the Navy, and how did you morph into the warfighter performance aspect of your job?
Well, my position with the Navy also came very randomly, and this is something that I always encourage my students to do as well, as like through networking. So I basically cold emailed my predecessor. At the time, I was in the Cleveland Clinic, and I wanted to move back to California, and so I started looking at positions. I was going to take a tenure track position at a university in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown, and I was myself and another candidate were up for this final position. However, at the time, unfortunately, I was going through a divorce, so I wanted to go back home where my family and everyone was. So I started
Hmm.
to look for opportunities back in California, and I honestly was just searching, and I came across the command that I work at now, and I cold emailed my predecessor, and he said at the time he had no positions available, and that was I think in January of 2010. You fast forward to the end of May, and I was speaking at the American College of Sports Medicine's annual conference. My mentor at the Cleveland Clinic was supposed to give a keynote address, and he couldn't. And so he asked me to fill in for him. So I filled in for him and then just went to the job board and started looking at the job postings that ACSM is really good about. And there was a flyer from this guy I cold emailed, and I reached out to him through the conference. I emailed him. I said, I don't know if you remember me. He's like, oh, I do. So we met in person and we chatted, and that's kind of how it all started. And so, I do encourage people to really, check the job boards at conferences, reach out to people. I tell students this all the time, people that you'd like to work with, they might not have something for you at the time, but if you reach back out to them, at least you left a little mark, in their memory. So that's
Sure. Well,
how,
it never hurts.
yeah.
Never hurts to ask. Never hurts to
No,
ask.
no, I have students, I have people reaching out to me through, LinkedIn all the time. I just talked to a student at the end of last week that reached out to me through there, just asking me questions on, career opportunities, internships, mentorship, and things like that. So yeah, so I did that, and then came out for an interview and got the job. So it was pretty straightforward. Um,
Hmm.
I had no idea anything about working in the military sector. I'd been working in obesity related diseases prior to that, and exercise and sport, but it was just a matter of translating my information and my knowledge, and talking to a lot of people, embedding myself in different communities that I was working with to really understand their needs, of their needs, and figuring it out from there. So when I came out to my first assignment with the Navy, was looking at load carriage or back injuries, or back pain in our infantry Marines. And so I basically just spent a lot of time up at Camp Pendleton with various Marine groups, talking to different people, observing, you know, and that's how I, started my career there.
So let's dig into that a little bit as far as what your day to day job would be like. When you say you're observing stuff, are you watching people do different job tasks and then seeing or looking for areas where there may be a way to improve their movement or a safer way to do something? Is that, I mean, I'm grossly oversimplifying, I know, but
You know what, honestly, it really depends on the project. And so our projects are funded. So we write grants. Our command is like analogous to like an academic institution. So we write grants
okay.
and we receive funding similar to, anyone in academia. And that funding or the grant calls are based on where the National Defense Appropriation Act is. So where Congress has decided that money is allocated to. And so it's varied over the years, but fortunately for my team and myself, we've always been in physical readiness, physical fitness, physical standards, kind of in injury prevention, human performance optimization, which kind of is a common thread throughout all the years, especially
Hmm.
since we were at war for so long, and then even though now we're in peacetime, we still have this push to make sure our physical standards are correct, and looking at physical readiness and the physical capabilities of our military. So it really just kind of depends on what the requests are. Sometimes you get direct requests from different groups that you're working with, to help them address a knowledge gap or a capability gap, or if they want to expand their capabilities into a certain area. So it's not a cookie cutter
Okay.
type, yeah, type
It's real
research.
custom. It's real custom, isn't
It's
it?
custom, and you also have to be pretty, like my team and I are comprised of like I say, more systemic physiologist with an emphasis in exercise physiology. I do have performance dietitian, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, the whole gamut. All of us are
Mm.
sort of cross like multidisciplined in that aspect, so we can cover a wide range of different efforts. But it is really solid research. You follow the research process where a lot of times it is observation and characterization of the community to identify what are their needs, what is causing the most injuries, or what is causing uh, I don't know if they want to expand their capabilities for work in extreme environment type conditions. So whether it's altitude or Arctic or heat or or undersea or whatever it may be, whatever the environment is that they need to go into. And so then you have to really understand, the human body A from the beginning, and then as physiologists we already know that, but then you start really targeting reading on, how does the body adapt to heat or how does the body adapt to cold. So you just remind yourself of things that you studied probably back when you're in your schooling, but then you dive deeper into that area of publication or that area of research that's going to most help you understand what the military needs for that environment, if that makes sense. So
No, it does make sense. Is there one particular group that you typically, depending on the branch of the military that you're dealing with, is there one particular group that you typically start with? Is it usually special forces, or is it, how does that play out?
no, it just really depends on who has what needs, and then sometimes, as it, with any world, like who you know. So if you have no other professionals in a different group, whether it's the infantry or special operations or the army, like my team and I've worked with with many different types of groups over the years, then so it's knowing the leadership, understanding what they do. For us, we started doing field research initially, so we've never done lab-based research. So when you're out in the field and you're talking with different individuals and you're talking to leadership and you're briefing leadership, and then they get wind of what you're doing, and then it's then they tell someone else, and then word gets passed on your specialty and your
Uh,
capabilities, and then that's how you get connected with other groups. Plus for myself, I sit on a lot of different committees, tri-service committees, and so through those collaboration on basic collateral duties that I do, I meet a lot of different people in different branches of service where you then work on collaborations, and so
mm,
that's kind of how you meet the groups. It's not like a typical research path, if that makes sense.
no,
So
it does.
yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you mentioned something a second ago about dealing with either extreme cold or extreme heat. I've made a career in the fire service, and one of my current jobs now, on a very basic level, is to deal with the hydration of the fire crews when we have working fires. And so, in January, it's not much of a concern to get dehydrated. In August in Missouri, when the humidity is through the roof and it's 99 degrees and you're wearing 55, 60 pounds of gear, it's very unpleasant to say the least. And electrolytes and hydration become a main priority. Are there, and I'm using this podcast as an opportunity to help myself improve my job and help the guys that I serve. Is there any advice you could give me as far as what I could do to improve their working environment and keep them safe?
Well, one is definitely, yeah, make sure you're on your hydration and electrolytes. Obviously, I can't endorse any type of product, but
Sure. Sure.
I would say always finding the balance between like having enough sodium and your potassium, your chloride, your magnesium, your calcium, which is another one that people often forget about, is that calcium is really important for muscle contraction, relaxation, heart function. So making sure
Hmm.
you have a balanced, electrolytes and also balanced food. Sometimes we forget that the caloric intake or having adequate calories is what's going to help us sustain. And when you're saying when you're hot and you're dehydrated, oftentimes our hunger mechanisms suppressed, and so we don't really want to eat. But finding foods or eating foods that are high in water content, high in electrolytes, are really helpful. And then just and being proactive about it consistently. I know you can't predict when a fire is going to happen, but it's staying on
Hmm.
top of your hydration and nutrition on the day-to-day basis. Like people tend to train up to something, but if it's just maintaining throughout, then that's going to help you in the long run, especially if you start to get into a depleted state. Your body's a little bit, it's already set up for having, a good balance versus already being in a depleted state, or might be on the low end of being properly hydrated or, with proper electrolytes. And then you go into a fire, you go into a situation where you may be working long hours, you're in equipment that's not breathable, where you're sweating excessive amounts, so we
Hmm.
have similar problems with our guys when they're wearing their personal protective gear, especially when they were in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had a lot of heat issues, and a lot of research was focused on heat at the time, and
Hmm.
heat casualties. The other thing is that we would recommend is also watching consumption of energy drinks, because people, when they're working long hours, tend to consume monsters and things with a lot of the
Yeah.
caffeine and other supplements in it,
Yeah.
and that actually dehydrates you. So you have to be mindful of just, you know kind of holistically what you're putting in your system, because you don't want to by accident dehydrate yourself by consumption of these energy type drinks, and or if you have too much of a compound that has, too high of a sugar content, it could disrupt like the gut, and you might not be able to absorb, the water and the solutes that you need, as well. So it's just really kind of keeping in balance there.
So a little bit of caffeine is okay, but not three
Not
monsters
a
in a shift.
exactly. Yeah.
All right. Are Is there anything else? I think we had talked originally a few weeks ago when we spoke on the phone. You had mentioned chocolate milk was something that was a pretty good drink to drink after a workout or after a stressful. Do I remember correctly?
Yeah, there's some old studies that, looked at chocolate milk because it has protein, it has carbohydrate, it's a good mix, it's palatable. Most people like chocolate milk, so
Mm,
having it, nowadays with the flux of protein, pre-made protein drinks, someone can buy a protein drink, but they're expensive, right? So you can go in and
yeah.
buy, although I haven't checked the price of chocolate milk lately, but you could go in and
Might
buy
have gone up.
usually a carton of milk, or a little carton of little chocolate thing of chocolate milk for less than $1, versus you're spending like $5 or $6 or $4 on a protein drink. So
Right.
if you're looking at the cost analysis on that, chocolate milk or just milk in general gives you more bang for your buck as far as cost savings, where it has the mix of protein. If you have a low fat version, you have some fat in there, and you have the carbohydrates that you need to kind of adequately replenish yourself, more so you know than if not drinking anything, especially if you're trying to find a quick meal replacement. I'm dating myself again, because back when I used to do a lot of racing and things like that, all we had was Ensure drinks or Slim Fast shakes.
Yeah.
This was before,
Yep.
we have, you can go in the grocery store and find any kind of protein, drink you want. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Has there been anything in your industry? You've been doing it for a while now. You've got a lot of experience. Is there anything that you've noticed was just a huge pivot or a huge change that really benefited people that are you know, in the military, that are wearing the heavy equipment, in the fire service or athletes or whatever? Anything that's just kind of like an earth-shattering shift or out of the box concept?
I think the use of wearables, and
Oh.
and my students will tell you this, it's both good and bad, because nowadays wearables, like, again, I've been a runner since I ran cross country in high school. And back then I had like a Garmin 200, I think. It was this huge, bulky thing
Mhm.
that was half my arm practically, and then over time, the wearables have shrinked in technology. And so, yeah, it's still, um, I'm not promoting Garmin, but I still wear a Garmin. I have a Polar, I have an Aura Ring. We have a suite of different, wearables that, consumers use. And we, both on the commercial market and the military side, everyone's using wearables, which I think to really help pinpoint and help with training practices, identify recovery. I think that's the biggest thing that's come about, is we're really focused more on recovery and recovery strategies than we ever have been before. Back when I was playing sports, whether it was in high school and throughout I didn't play collegiate sports, but I maintained, started running marathons and things when I was in college, is we focus more on heart rate, intensity, is more on performance. We didn't really think so much about recovery. Nowadays, we're really focused more on recovery and different recovery modalities. And I think the, wearables have given us those tools, whether you're monitoring your resting heart rate, your HRV, your sleep, your body
Mhm.
temperature, to really see, how, people are recovering, which helps informs training schedules, training practices. So I think the use of wearables has, helps quite a bit. I also say people get way too in the weeds on them as well. Like if you just go back to the basics of physiology and understand heart rate and breath rate and controlling your breath and controlling your loads, you can manage yourself with some very simple technology. You don't need all the fancy outcome metrics, if that makes sense. Like some of these wearables give you 40 different bits of
Yeah.
information, and sometimes it's information overload for the
Yeah.
average person, you know.
Well, it can almost make you neurotic because you're like, well, I
Oh
got to
yeah,
get an ice bath and I have to go sit in the sauna and I have to get 9 hours of sleep and I have to have, it's like, well, good grief. You don't have time in the day to live your life because you're checking all these boxes based on what this gadget's telling you to do.
exactly. And that's what I always say to, as people, especially my students, I say, use it as like a monitor. Like you don't live or
Mm,
die by it. Like there's times I wake up and my wearables are like, you didn't sleep well last night. You need to do this. I'm like, well, I got a 10-mile run today. Sorry. And I go and do it, And so it's like you also have to like be your own judge on how your body feels. And some days you don't
sure.
feel well and you're like, okay, and your ring tells you or your watch tells you, you feel great, go, climb a mountain. You're like, well, I actually don't feel very good. So you kind of have to use both. You use it to monitor yourself and look at the changes and trends over time. But also, if you're off by one, I see some people get caught up on like, well, my heart rate's 2 beats per minute higher than yesterday. I'm like, it's negligible. You have to consider the errors associated with these devices and human physiology varies so much. Something I always used to say in the classroom is like, every day you wake up, you're a new person. There's not a single cell that's the same in you today that there was yesterday, So
Hmm.
I always joked with my students, if you don't like yourself today, just go to sleep and tomorrow you're a new person and you have a chance to start again, And so it's always
Yeah.
like a reset when you go to sleep at night. It's a reset, So that's why sleep is very important. And I am a huge advocate of getting good sleep, for both physical and mental health.
That's one thing that I have struggled with. I've been woken up so many times in my career. Everybody responds to stress in their career in different ways. And one of the things that's really gotten through on me is my sleep for a number of years was just awful. I would wake up 3, 4, 5 times a night, just wide awake, and I had no idea why, and I was exhausted. And I think after 26 years in the fire service, I'm so used to getting jolted awake at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning that my body just does that even when I don't need to.
Right.
And I know that when I finally have worked on my sleep and done multiple things to get it to improve, everything about your life improves when you get a good night's sleep.
Oh, definitely. It helps regulate your hormones, which is the primary, if you have hormonal disruption or hormonal dysregulation, that's going to affect your mood, and
Mm,
behaviors. It leads to different symptoms and then it leads to behavior changes and it becomes this vicious cycle. But if you just,
yeah.
people ask me a lot, what are your recommendations? It's just like get good sleep, drink plenty of water, and that cures about 99% of all ailments pretty much. As if you're well nourished and you have good sleep, it kind of corrects the system. But
Yeah.
those things, like you said, especially if you're in a high stress job or you have a job that's very kinetic and dynamic, a lot of that, even though you might go to sleep at night and you're tired, you probably don't realize you're in like a low grade state of like fight or flight type response. Or you have a heightened, autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system input that that people don't recognize they fall into. And I believe, especially in our current society with all the smartphones and access to everything, or the fear of missing out, or whatever they call it, makes people sort of in this hyper stress state that they probably don't even recognize that they're in because they've become so accustomed to it. But then it leads to sleep disruption usually.
Yeah.
So,
It's that low level stress that's just always right there on the edge.
exactly. And so that's
S-
why it's good to set up good sleep practices at a young age, like have good sleep hygiene. But a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to give up my TV in my bedroom, or I don't want to do this at night. But it's like, well, then recognize that that's your decision, and then that's impacting your sleep. So don't complain about your sleep if you're not willing to do the work to correct it. At least that's my
Yeah.
opinion.
No, that's
You
that's
know?
pretty good advice. I mean,
Yeah.
that sometimes you got to be kind of blunt on that. It's like, well, then your situation's not going to improve if you're not going to do what you need to do.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Take ownership of it.
yeah.
So, yeah.
So let's dive into I want to get your advice. Let's say that someone approached you, they're finishing up their bachelor's degree. They want to follow in your footsteps. They like your line of work. They want to they're asking you for advice. What advice can you give someone, maybe looking back on your career, where there are areas? I know you took a little bit of a different path with family and whatnot, but is there any advice that you could give someone to maybe help them streamline their education as far as I took these classes or I did this over here and I don't really think that was worthwhile. If I could go back, I wouldn't do that. I would do this instead, or any kind of advice like that?
My biggest advice is to do internships. I take a lot of interns. I have two right now. One's graduating on Monday, which I'm excited about. She was amazing, but I don't even know how many interns I've had over the years. And it does take a lot to mentor. It takes a lot of time from myself and my team, but it's so valuable. And throughout
Yeah.
my career, during my undergrad, I volunteer. So a lot of times people want to have paid internships. But I've always done volunteer internships, or my students we have a lot of educational partnership agreements set up with various universities. And so our Office of Navy Research has a really great internship program for high school, college, and graduate students. So there's a lot of internship opportunities out there that people just need to seek out. And I think then if they can go and do an internship in a field, even if it's volunteer that they think they want to go into, then they'll discover really quickly, oh, I like this or I don't like this. And so throughout my entire career,
Mm.
I've always volunteered, I've always done internships, I've networked, you talk to a lot of people. Um, I do this like I mentioned last week. I talked to a student that reached out. So I think it's finding people that are willing to give you the time. If you just take 30 minutes out of your day to counsel someone, talk with them, go observe something, and volunteer. And you can set the parameters. I just say the biggest thing is that, and I do this with my interns and my volunteers is, I make them commit a certain amount of time, because it is a lot on my team and myself to train people or to get them up to speed on projects or whatever they're doing. So if you really are going to go volunteer and do an internship, like dedicate a certain amount of time. Like I will give this 3 months or 6 months. I can do 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week, but set those boundaries up ahead of time with whoever you want to work with, and I guess compromise on what's agreeable to both of you. But that's my best recommendation is actually get out and do what you think you want to do, because then you'll quickly discover whether or not you like that or not.
So what I'm hearing from you is you have to be your own advocate and go after, you have to make the calls, the cold emails, the cold phone calls. You have to look for people that are willing to be your mentor. And then if you do get someone to agree, you need to really commit because you're gambling on yourself to find
Correct.
out my future career. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Correct. And I have a lot of my former students are at our command in full-time job capacities. My team, several of my team members and my team members of the years have been former students of mine that were interns, because it goes both ways. It gives the intern an opportunity to see if that's something they really like. It also gives the mentor an opportunity to see if that intern's a good fit. And
Mm,
so I actually, had a job opening years ago, and I reached out to one of my interns who wanted to work with me, but I didn't have an opening at the time. And a couple of years had gone by, and I had an opening on my team, and I reached back out to her and I said, are you still interested? And she had another full-time job at the time, but she left that position to come and work for us. And so if you're a good intern, you leave a mark usually on the people that you're with. Um, so it can come full circle is my point.
Now, what you just said a minute ago is you highlighted that this is a two-way street as far as the mentor is getting to see if this person is going to make a good team member in the future. Let's dive into that. What type of person is going to be a good fit for your line of work?
Someone that is a people person, so they have to have really good interpersonal people skills, that
Okay.
can be flexible, as far as, things change in our world a lot all the time. I will be flying to a data collection for what I think is going to happen. By the time I land, I'll have multiple text messages on a change in the plan. And so you just have to learn to be flexible and understand that, things do change and you need to adjust. So it's being able to think critically and qualitatively and rapidly on, okay, how can we adjust this to fit the new paradigm that we're going into. Team player for me, I keep my team small, but we all know how to do every job. So that's not how everyone runs their teams. Some people have definite like designated roles on their team. I have a saying on my team is that we all pick up the trash. So no one person is greater than another person. We're all kind of equal, especially when we're out in the field doing work. My team knows I'm quote the boss, but we don't treat each other that way. We treat each other as
Hmm.
equals. And so I think that, it just depends on your team dynamics. So, but I would say that's the biggest things is being able to, to be flexible, be a team player, you know, I don't want to say don't have an attitude. That doesn't sound nice, but like basically, like,
Yeah.
you know, be willing to, to help out wherever is needed. Yeah, cross-disciplined, you kind of have to know a lot. Manage personalities, basically have good interpersonal skills is what's going to help in my particular line of work. Like we work with other people that are engineers and whatnot, and they're, just behind computers doing work, and that's fine. So there's a role for everyone. It just depends on what it is that they want to do. And so that's a question that they can ask their mentor or their prospective employer, is what are your expectations of me? Like I have people been on my team in the past that are just happy being behind the computer number crunching. And we're like, that's great. That's what we know. Or they want to stay at home because they have small kids, they don't want to travel. Then we keep them as our anchor, as we call them, and they're rooted here at home and they're not traveling. Or, so it's just also asking those questions when you're in an interview of what are the job expectations, and in asking and answering yourself honestly, like, am I willing to do this or not? I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, it absolutely does. We use a phrase at work. Usually it's jokingly because it's very cringy, but it's teamwork makes the dream work. And everybody
right,
has their areas where they excel. And it's not always the person next to you is shares that. So you all just kind of fill in the gaps.
right, we
What
do.
what go ahead, sorry.
No, just say, yeah, we do, except for, like I said, I think it's important where it goes both ways. Like we've done job interviews where we'll say this is what we need and what we expect. And we've had other people come back to us and say, well, I have, 5 dogs and 3 cats and I don't want to leave them to go travel for extended periods of time. It's like, okay, well then this might not be the best job for you.
Right.
And so it's like I
Right.
think like setting those saying it openly up front, but on both sides. Like some people will just want to get the job so bad they'll say anything, but then when it actually comes to execution of that job tasks, they fail, and then and so it doesn't go well. Do you know what I mean? So you have to be
Sure.
honest
Yes.
on both sides, if that that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have most people you mentioned interpersonal skills. Are most of the folks that you work with typically extroverted or the introverted, or do you have a wild mix?
It's a mix. I mean, I'd say most
Okay.
are extroverted, but I mean, it depends, I guess, on how you define it. But just being able
Yeah.
to get along with different types of personalities, different communities, in our world, and same with yours, I'm imagining, it's you have different hats that you have to wear, right?
Mhm.
Depending on whether you're dealing with officers, enlisted, various people, you treat everyone with respect no matter what. But there's just
Sure.
different expectations on how you uh, talk, speak, relate, communicate, handle yourself in
Mhm.
in different scenarios. So I guess reading the room is what they would
Oh,
call it.
yeah.
So yeah, being able to read a room. So
That
uh,
is yeah, that is a very, important skill in any career.
correct.
What what do you like most about your job? If someone said, "Tell me your top 1 or 2 things that you just that's what gets you up out of bed every day."
The people that we're serving. So I really believe in our mission. I believe in helping improve our military, keeping them safe, making sure that they're healthy and that they come home to their families. Like I think that's where, we don't get a lot of credit on our research. Our research is delivered to senior leadership, that you'll say get the credit for changes that we've made to policy or gear design or whatever. But none of us in my field or on my team do it for the accolades. And so I think that's something that's important is we're not there to get famous. We're not trying to be
Yeah.
on TV as the next, you know, athletic trainer for, I don't know, San Francisco 49ers or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like
Mhm.
we don't do it for the notoriety. You do it actually because we believe in our mission, we believe in what we're doing, we believe in helping our active duty, and their family, so that they can have a good quality of life and that they can be healthy and safe and defend our freedom. So that's, I'd say, the biggest factor that drives me, and actually everyone that works on my team, I'd say is really our core values on why what we're doing, is servicing our country. So that's actually my one and two. I would say that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I mean, I think yes, none of us like the paperwork and some of the collateral duties that we have associated with our jobs. However, that's in any job, having to do paperwork or do training or whatever it is we do. But I'd say the number one
Sure.
thing is the mission. And then two, I really enjoy like the people that I work with, not that are directly on my team, like everyone else in my department, my colleagues throughout the other services. I think all of us have that same common uh, purpose, and so it's nice when
Hmm.
you have a lot of, you're all there for the same reason, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
No, absolutely. What's your best advice? And I always ask this question because I love to see the different answers that I get. I like to talk about failure because we all are human beings. We all will make mistakes. But I think how you respond to that mistake is 99% of it. So, what's your advice when you have a team member or someone that works for you that makes a mistake? How do you handle that? And how do you advise them to move past it, to learn from it, or whatever?
Well, failure is how we learn, right? I think there's a quote. I don't want to say Yoda said this in one of the Star Wars movies. So it's something
Yeah.
like, what's the difference between a master and a beginner? And the difference is that a master has, basically has tried and failed more times than a beginner has. And that's where that's paraphrasing the quote. But so that's where we learn. We learn through our failures, and I learned that from my PhD advisor up at USC. She always said to me, "There's no failed experiments. You always learn from what you did wrong." And so we'd sit there and go through like, what did I did wrong, or why did this not work out, or and it continued even when I was working on my postdoc in
Mhm.
Cleveland Clinic, trying to do some basic science stuff. I was like, well, this didn't work out, or this, or my cells died, or this happened, or whatever. But then it's like you start to go back through the steps and you see like what how you troubleshoot, right? So on my team, it's the same. The same with my students when they've had issues or failed an exam or whatever. It's, look back at, what potentially could have influenced that decision that you made that led to failure, and then how can we grow from it? Let's not dwell on it. It's in the past, but let's just like move forward,
Mhm.
from it. And I say, that I've used that in my running career, where you have bad races versus good races. You look at whether it's the mindset, did I not train hard enough? Did I overtrain? So you kind of look at, I think failure is an opportunity to grow. So people should, I know it's hard not to get down on yourself, but at the same time, unless it's a catastrophic failure, those are the things.
Yeah.
But we look at them as like survivable failures. And I had a good mentor, uh, within the special ops community that used to say that to me. He's like, "Is this a survivable failure?" I'm like, "Oh, it's is yes." And that's what you kind of say, "This is a survivable failure." And so you learn, so.
That is an important distinction between failures that are just catastrophic and others where, okay, we screwed up, we can learn from it and let's move on, kind of a thing.
Right. But I think you put contingencies in place. Like with my team, it's the same thing. I kind of have like, I'd say it's like an open door policy, always like ask questions. Like there's no, I mean, it sounds cliche, but there are no stupid questions, there are no wrong questions. But I'd rather you ask a question and let me guide you and steer you, or let's work it out together. Or if you did something wrong, again, like I've had people on my team come back to me like, "Hey, Karen, I did this. I realized later I wasn't supposed to do this." I'm like, okay, so let's figure out a way to like A, fix this problem, and then B, how not to let it happen again, but that's just the approach, that I take. So
Sure. The the question that people always want to know is about pay. What
yes.
is there a and I always preface this, if you live in California versus Missouri or New York versus Montana, there's going to be a difference in the pay because the cost of living varies wildly. But is there a general ballpark that you could provide as far as what potential earnings may be in your field?
I'd say within a if you have a master's degree, it's usually I think between like 70 and 80,000, I believe. And then if
Okay.
you have a higher level degree, if you're up above 100, it just depends again, like you said, locality and whether you're at a private institution, a
Hmm.
government, academic, it is gonna vary wildly, but I'd say about, 65 to 80 for a master's, and then above that with a doctoral degree in our field.
Okay. Was there another career that you thought that you kind of toyed around with when you were younger? I know you talked about biology and you kind of, I think early on, you kind of had a lane that you were narrowing down, but was there something that you kind of thought that's just completely out of left field and that's kind of interesting, but in the long run, obviously you didn't?
Well, it's related to science, but I always wanted to be an astronaut, actually,
Oh,
as
really?
a kid. Oh, yeah. And I remember I was in the fourth grade and we were watching The Right Stuff on TV as a family.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I
Yeah.
want to be an astronaut. My mom's like, Karen, there's like four people ever that ever go into space. And she like crushed my dream, and I was like, just jokingly. But
Yeah.
years ago, my daughter will tell you that when NASA opened up, I think it was in 2018, I can't remember, they had this huge push for astronauts. And at the time, I was obviously over the age mark, but for just the heck of it, I'm like, I'm going to throw my application. And my daughter, remember, was so upset with me. She's like, Mom, if you go to Mars, I'm never going to forgive you. And I'm like, I'm never, I'm like, I'm not going to Mars, but it's just something I have to do. So full
Yeah.
disclosure, I put in an application. Of course, I was rejected because of my age and probably a bunch of other things. However, I was like, it was just one of those like childhood dreams that I'm like, I want to be an astronaut. So, I've always been into the sciences. I've always, this is going to sound very strange too, but I've always been interested in postmortem. So for a long time, I was also thinking about being like a forensic, um, not a pathologist, but like looking at like after people, an investigator, like a forensic investigator,
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
at, trying to like, but
Hmm.
my mom's like, you like working with alive people, Karen. You don't want to like study dead people. So my mom, bless her little heart, she was a CPA, like she was an accountant, but she
Right.
always was like the voice of reason. Whereas my father always like entertained Karen's wildest, you know, uh, weird things, like I remember once in the second grade or no, seventh grade, I had to dissect something for biology class. And of course I couldn't pick something normal like a rat or something. I was like, I want a seahorse and an eel. So my dad somehow found some company and like ordered me a seahorse and an eel to dissect for a diorama or whatever I had. So yes,
Man.
I had the balance between my very realistic mom that tethered me to earth and then my father who would just let me fly above the planet and dream
Chase your
wildly.
dreams. Well,
Yeah,
that's a good balance to have. You've got the dreamer and you've got the practical one, and that they raise good
exactly.
kids. So you
Yeah.
know, you just said something a second ago, and I'm just curious. The astronauts, that's on my list. I don't know any astronauts, and I've tried to connect with a few on LinkedIn, but I haven't gotten anywhere so far for an interview. But what types of um, obstacles, as far as your line of work, do astronauts deal with? Like, I don't even know what
Oh, really?
how.
Gravity. Yes. Yeah, the gravitational forces. I mean, it affects their digestive system. I don't know. I
How
haven't
do
studied NASA, but a long time ago, I was connected to an astronaut. She was wonderful. We were looking at a product that could potentially help mitigate muscle wasting or sarcopenia during space
Mhm.
flight. And oh God, this is probably 10 or 12 years ago now. It started, so I haven't really studied much into it, but it's the same when you look at like undersea medicine, if you look at undersea, anything that has extreme pressure differences, and how it can affect like digestion. I mean, it sounds silly, but even like gas inside the intestinal tract,
Yeah.
they have issues with muscle wasting, sarcopenia, osteoporosis, because you don't realize how much gravity impacts bone development, muscle development, and so when you're in basically without gravity, you're just floating around.
Mhm.
You don't have that forces applied to your bones and your muscles that helps, them regenerate and regrow and stay strong. So they have a lot of varying, issues with respect to human performance, but, they have a very robust research program on, human
Sure.
performance that, addresses a lot of these issues. And so,
I hadn't
yeah,
even thought about gravity with related to digestion, but that makes total sense. I don't even how would they even overcome that in space?
well, it's just making sure the foods that they're being provided don't cause a lot of like gastrointestinal distress. And so when you've
Okay.
looked at like at times, I don't, we're looking at different, let's say, ketone supplementations for a while when like ketogenic diets and ketones were all the rave,
Mhm.
then it's like, well, how does that disrupt your not necessarily your gut microbiome, but how does that disrupt the gut? And everyone tolerates things differently. So you have to test those things in various environments to make sure that when you are up in space, if you're in a simulated environment, it's not going to cause, GI issues, whether you're up in space or under sea. So I know NASA also has a really great undersea program that they do, where they do, I think it's called Nemo. I can't remember the exact what the acronym stands for, but one of my friends was an aquanaut. So they do a lot underwater, so it's
Huh.
different. It's not the same as in space, but, they look at these changes in pressure and how that affects, multiple aspects of human physiology, not just digestion, but that's just, one of them, cognitive processing, change in hormone concentration, sleep, bone density, muscle wasting. So a lot of different aspects of the human system when you're in these
I
extreme,
would
real extreme environments.
I would think sleeping in space when you're just floating that would be weird. That would have to take a while to get used to.
Yeah, I would think so. I do know some individuals that can sleep underwater, which I also think is very unique. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a
Would
skill.
I would think isometrics would be something they could use to at least create some kind of resistance.
Yes. So they have looked at, like, they do isometrics. There are different, I'm not well versed in this, but there are different pieces of equipment they have, been able to put up on the space stations and deploy with them up there that to have create that tension that's needed on the muscle and the bone to help maintain some of or reduce some of that loss that occurs. There's some research that was done for a while into looking at blood flow restriction, type exercises to see if that can help, mitigate some of the, effects of sarcopenia that due to space flight or so there is a lot of research that's going on. I just personally haven't looked very much into it. It's just kind of like peripherally, I'll hear about things that go on.
I don't know. It sounds like you might want to resubmit that application, maybe with a
Oh,
different job description.
I don't know. Yeah, I know. I'm like, oh, one day. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be cool.
Yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, this has been a very interesting interview. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I know you have a busy schedule, so I do thank you for taking the time to talk with me. And hopefully, somebody listening that wants to follow in your career has got a lot of good kernels of advice that they can take and use to be successful.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Anyone can find me on LinkedIn if they have, want to see more about what I do or what I have done and reach out to me through that mechanism.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doctor. I appreciate it.
I appreciate your time, Tim. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully, you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.